Good morning to all. Good afternoon. This is Diego Guarin. I'm the co-chair of the Health Policies Working Group at FI Pharma, and I'm also employed by MSD, Regional Market Access Leader. So today, we are very happy to close the 2022 web series that we are doing in partnership with eSport, FI Pharma and eSport, to talk about the availability and access to innovative therapies in Latin America. And basically, what we are going to show you, or what we're going to share with you, is a preview of the results that we have in doing the patient's weight indicator. Some of you might have heard about the weight indicator from Europe, the European Pharmaceutical Association. So basically, what we are doing is partnering with IQVIA to bring the weight indicator to Latin America, and Max is going to walk us through the results later. Can we have the next slide, please? So the agenda, basically, we're having an opening by my own, an introduction. I'm going to share with you some of the journey that we have been doing with FI Pharma when we talk about access to innovative medicines. And then we're going to have Max Newton. I will introduce him in a few seconds, where he is going to present the key highlights of their survey that we conducted in 8 countries in the region. And then after Max covers all the methodology and the key results, we are going to have Janet Jihad. She is the executive director in FI Pharma. Also, I will introduce her later in a few minutes to provide the perspective from the trade association in Latin America. At the end, we are going to answer questions from you. So please use the Q&A option in Zoom, so we can get your answers, your questions answered at the end in the moderated panel. So let's do the next one, please, Max. So here is the bios of Max and Janet and myself. So basically, Max is leading in IQVIA the working in the Global Supplier and Association team. He has been working in different projects, not only with private companies and pharma companies, but also with the European Commission, the WHO, and the European Medicine Agency. And he has worked in projects that cover more than 40 countries, including those 8 in Latin America that we just add for the FI Pharma weight indicator. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Warwick and also a master's degree from the UCL, both in the UK, and he's based in the UK. Also, we have Janet Jihad. She has been, amazing trajectory in the public and lately in the private sector. So she's currently the executive director at FI Pharma. And before that, she was the executive director in AFIDE, the local trade association in Colombia. Prior to joining the pharmaceutical sector, Janet was the Colombian Minister of Education, also director of Colciencias, that is the Science and Technology Agency in Colombia, and deputy ministers of Defense. So Janet is an economist from Los Andes University in Colombia, and also she has a master's degree from the University Javeriana in Colombia, and also from the King's College in London. So with this, we'll go to the next one, Max, please. So today we are talking about the weight indicator, but I wanted to highlight what that FI Pharma has been doing since 2016, right? So what is our aim, right? And this is the acronym that you see here, Access to Innovative Medicine. Our aim as a pharmaceutical R&D trade association is to facilitate or to ensure that patients have access to the innovations, right? That's basically our purpose in pharma industry, and also the purpose of the healthcare systems, right? To deliver care to their populations. And we have been doing work, partnering with IQVIA, in looking at how the countries in the region, and here are 3 reports that I will cover very briefly, in Colombia, in Chile, and Peru, that we commissioned in 2016, 2018, and 2019 to start doing a benchmark, right, on how we were comparing between our countries in the region that are members of the OECD, and also with other countries that are members of the OECD. So you see some snapshots of the report. The links are in the bottom. You can have access to these reports, and those reports were developed in collaboration with the local trade association and were presented and discussed with the stakeholders from the government, payers, academics, policymakers, to start talking about the issues or the hurdles that we face when we think about access to innovation. And remember that access to innovative therapies starts from the regulatory approval, right? After we have the regulatory approval, the market authorization, then we go to have a pricing decision if there is a process established in the country, or to set the price, and then we start looking for reimbursement in private and public sector. And what you see here is different snapshots, as I mentioned, of the reports comparing time to get reimbursement. In the case of Colombia, in the left, in the middle, we have the percentage of medicines that are reimbursed in Chile versus other countries. And then in the last one, you have only for Peru, the percentage of medicines that were registered in Peru and also were reimbursed in the different subsystems that exist in that country. So we were planning to do this in 2020. The pandemic, the COVID pandemic affected some of our plans, but then we came with this pharma weight indicator that is including 8 countries, right? So instead of doing country by country, only OECD, that basically are four countries in the region, we're now going to share with you the results in 8 countries, and we cover 185 medicines that were new active substances in like 6 years period, and looking at this approved by EMA and FDA, and looking how these products are approved or not in the country, in the region, and then reimbursed or not, and available for patients in the different healthcare systems. So without any other delay, I will pass to Max so he can talk about the pharma weight indicator. Go ahead, Max. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Diego. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My session will take you through a little bit of the history of the weight indicator, the study methodology, because I think for the purposes of this call, it's really important to understand how the study is structured, what it covers, what it doesn't cover, and how it collects all the information within it to provide what I'm going to show you in the third section, which is the results at an aggregated level for the 8 Latin American markets. So as Diego mentioned, I've been with IQVIA now for a long time, and I've been working on the European study, the European weight indicator. The European weight indicator is a long-running study from which this Latin American study that we're going to show you builds upon. The history of it is very interesting and important to understand, given the dynamics of the access landscape across Europe have changed significantly, and the dynamics of the pharmaceutical market access landscape will continue to develop long-term. So in Europe, this study's been running since 2004, so a significantly long-running approach. And I started running this project as the project lead in 2019. We included a ton of new countries, we expanded the scope, and we ended up with nearly 40 European markets. So that's all EU 27 countries, plus countries like Kazakhstan and Russia, for example, included in the approach. We've then developed this within Europe to take a different view and to look at the extent to which companies submit information on pricing and reimbursement in certain markets, and that's a parallel stream that runs alongside the feature of the weight indicator. But the purpose of this really is to highlight what the Latin American study is built off, and it's built off a long-running amount of experience and expertise in how to manage the different access approaches across different countries, and how to get a good picture and a good benchmark to understand the landscape. The importance of this then is to highlight what the study that we're showing you today is and what it will be in the future. So in a short-term approach, what we've been working on in 2022 is a pilot study to test the methodology. And what you'll see in the third section is, I would consider much more than a pilot. We have a very good data set that we'll show you, and some very good conclusions can be drawn, but it's still in the early phases. Our approach was really to develop a standardized process for collecting information from associations and member companies on the status, the public reimbursement status of products in Latin American countries. We also wanted to make sure that we weren't trying to bite off more than we could chew. And by that, I mean making sure that we appreciate that there will be gaps in the data in this first instance, and learning from the European study. New countries joining can take 2-3 years before they fully understand how to collect the information from public sources, have the capacity to cover all of the medicines that we wish to study. And then the last is to publish the aggregated set of key performance indicators. That's important to understand because the study itself is not a white paper, it's a set of key performance indicators that cover the access landscape across Latin America to try and provide a foundation from which discussions can be had at local levels, not regional levels, on what the markets truly look like. Long term, our goal is to run this on an ongoing basis, and we therefore will refine the methodology over time. This first study that we've run this year focuses on oncology medicines and orphan medicines only. This is because, as I will show you in a few slides' time, what we asked companies to do is actually provide a significant amount of information, and we didn't want to overload them on the first instance. So over time, we'll expand the universe of information that we're collecting and perhaps expand the country scope. But this fourth point in the bottom right-hand corner is the most important, is to establish the reputation as a trustworthy and high-profile study that can be used by all stakeholders in the debate on access. So, to go into the study methodology, I've given you the background as to how the study's been formed over time, but what it looks like in Latin America is a survey of fee pharma member associations using and leveraging in-market experts to complete a significantly large Excel survey list to provide dates, to provide the status of reimbursement across their different countries, and in many instances to provide dates on local marketing authorization as well. We approximately cover about 90 to 95% of all of the major molecules in the region, therefore making this a solidly representative study. Diego touched on this before. We cover 185 innovative medicines. These are focused on oncology and orphan, and I will show you in a later slide how we funneled and how we got to that figure. These results are accurate. The reimbursement status information is accurate as of June the 1st, 2022. This is simply because of the time it takes to collect the information, assess, quality check, and to produce the results. There will always be a small lag behind. So the way we did it was to really understand what is out there for patients to receive. What are the global new active substances or innovative medicines available to patients across the world? We took this list, there's an IQVIA source for this called the Global New Active Substance List. We took these products that have been launched in the past 6-year period, 2014 to 2020, and we do that for a certain reason, which is to give an amount of time for reimbursement to occur in markets. We know there is a certain time lag for products to enter the market, and therefore trying to understand the reimbursement status for a very newly launched medicine doesn't provide us with the input that we need. So we start with this global view from 2014 to 2020. We then funnel down to say, let's ensure we can make this project manageable for local associations and companies. And so we take this down to orphan and oncologic medicines only, giving us 209. We then remove things like diagnostic tools, vaccines, hospital solutions, and instances where we see that products are launched in, let's say, non-US, non-EU or other markets that therefore might not be truly representative of a global innovative medicine that is changing patient health. We therefore end up with a list of 185 products. The tricky bit about this project is that these products can have 3 marketing authorization dates. You can have marketing authorization from US, from Europe, and locally. And so what we did within this study is take this information, and because the core purpose of the W.A.I.T indicator is to determine the time to access innovative medicines, we created a set of key performance indicators that measure this date from when the product has US approval, and then from EU approval, and then from local approval. And this really gives a full picture, a really full picture by which all stakeholders can work from. The study itself centers on 2 main metrics. It measures the rate of availability firstly, and the time to availability. And whilst we show you a set of 7 or 8 different key performance indicators, the study centers on 2 main metrics. How many medicines are available in a country, that's the rate of availability, and how long it takes, which is time. Within this availability definition, there are obviously segmentations to it. We're focused on full public reimbursement. That's the ultimate goal. However, we appreciate that there are many instances where there's limited reimbursement, and that could be from a payer's perspective. It could be due to the fact there's only value deemed in certain subpopulations. It could be there is a limited reimbursement permitted while decisions are pending, or it could be because there are managed entry agreements. And we take these all into consideration. You'll hear me refer later to the green available and yellow limited available categorizations throughout this discussion. We also appreciate that there is a significant private market, and where possible, we try to collect information on the availability on the private market. In the European study, this is less relevant, but for LATAM, this has increasing importance. And then obviously the red category is where it's not reimbursed or not reimbursed while decision is pending. I'm going to talk about completeness later on, so I will move very neatly to my next slide, which really highlights the core premise of the study, which is to understand availability. And that core concept allows us to measure 8 countries with different systems. And we're therefore looking at the local reimbursement of a globally approved innovative medicine. It takes into account things like managed entry agreements where possible, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the product is used within the market. So we're essentially highlighting this study is focused on public availability and that there are country-specific nuances which are being considered throughout. When we were creating this, we didn't create this ourselves as IQV, even though we have great expertise in the Latin American market, nor did we do this just with FIFARMA. We did this as a collaboration between all of the associations and industry to come up with what that definition, what the core definitions are within each country. And so here you see listed out across our 8 countries, what's the definition of full availability? And if there are any country-specific nuances for what would be categorized as limited availability. So for example, Colombia is a great example of a medicine's listed on PBS, then it's full. If it's available via MePress, then we consider that to be limited availability. And we have a set of KPIs that either focus on the full section or include both to provide a better view of the public reimbursement landscape. When considering the study, as I mentioned, when I showed the full strategic picture, it's important to take into account what our data completeness is. We have assessed the total 185 products that are new innovative medicines across that 6-year period. And what we did is highlight for you and for full transparency, the data that was provided by company members or company associations, that's the light blue. And then where possible, we essentially went to publicly available sources to try and complete some extra gaps where we could. So in Colombia, we reviewed the PBS list to confirm which products are fully available and which only have limited availability via MePress, as I mentioned. In Mexico, we've reviewed the compendium to determine public availability. In Brazil, we reviewed Conitec to determine additional public availability. And we went through each of these to try and provide an additional boost to the study. Over time, we foresee that this will be provided by company members and associations, but ultimately this gives us a good picture. For Costa Rica and Argentina, where there's limited publicly available resources, you can see there is a lower availability of the information within the study. But we still foresee that over time, this will improve as associations are able to reach out to members where possible. So bear this in mind as we go through the study. I think it's important to highlight to those that are joining today what the final result of the document will look like. I told you when we started this discussion that the results are key performance indicators. It's not a white paper, it's not verbatim, it's not a set of words, it's a set of it's an academic style study that provides a set of key performance indicators that can be used by all stakeholders. You will see in a few weeks' time when the final document is published, you'll have approximately 30 slides on the availability of medicines in Latin America. We'll look at a combined cohort of oncology plus orphan medicines. We then split out and we focus on the oncology segment itself and the oncology medicines and the orphan medicines. Now, bear in mind, there is overlap in that some instances, so those segments are not necessarily mutually exclusive. But this really gives an insight as to what you can look forward to when the study is finally launched. The aim is to have this as a foundation for countries to build their local narratives and to have an open discussion on the challenges in the local market. So what it doesn't do is provide a narrative of what the root causes are or what the specific nuances or rationale is in each country. What it does is provide a baseline and a foundation for that discussion. And we found that in Europe, this is extremely helpful when access discussions are happening. And we found that this study is being used by, for example, the University of Oxford to explain some of the access issues that are present in the pharmaceutical market, as well as by industry associations, by governments, and publicly available within newspapers, for example. So to explain what we actually will be showing, I think a step further, it's important to give a good view of the key performance indicators, why each one of them matter, and why we've chosen them. It's not simply a case that we've shown 30 graphs for no reason. We've picked those 30 graphs to provide a really good picture of the landscape. And what I will do in the next section is go through each of these, but this gives you an overview, and it says, we created the 7 KPIs that will look at the breakdown of the global availability, that 185 medicines cohort. We then look at instances where products are only, where which medicines are available in Latin America. And we can use a proxy as to how many products have a Latin American marketing authorization date to determine which have been launched in Latin America, for example. We can then see where there is restrictions, where there are restrictions to the availability of that medicine, perhaps through subpopulation restrictions or managed entry agreements or other payer restrictions. Then we look at the local availability. This gives us an insight into the reimbursement success within different markets. And then on the right-hand side, we look at the key performance indicators on time. One of the things we learned from working on this study in Europe is that many years ago, these key performance indicators were called the delay to access, delay to availability. And I think that sends the wrong message, because what we need to show truly is the time to availability. We cannot explicitly say that there is a delay from any particular stakeholder using these slides. These slides simply show the total time to availability. Firstly, from the local marketing authorization dates where we have them, versus when the molecules are available from the FDA's marketing authorization date. And then lastly, how it looks when you basically plot the total cohort across a timeline and see how does this compare from US to EU all the way to local. So without further ado, I'd like to go into the results with you, and I'll be going through exactly the same slides I showed you, but truly showing the results. So the first is to say, we're looking at first the global availability. That's the 185 medicines I showed you. And this really hard, the way to read this is to look at the different colored chart, different colored sections at the bottom, and to look at the full public availability, those with limited availability status, those that have only private availability, and those that are not available. We see from this picture that generally the rate of availability across Latin America is relatively low. It's around 24 products out of our 185 as an average, which is around 13%. You put this into context with, for example, the European study. This is just below the average for some countries and towards the lower end of the Central and Eastern European countries. I'm conscious that the natural reaction to this type of information is to compare country to country. And I think my counsel on this is to say that what's most appropriate is to focus on the country itself and to try and improve access within that market, rather than suggest that the situation is beneficial because you are higher than another country. Some commentary from our side is that Colombia generally we would consider looks high due to the definition of availability that we have here, whereas a large large proportion of the available products are considered limited availability, as these are non-PBS medicines, i.e. they're only available via MePress, which provides fairly restricted patient access. So it's important to take into consideration that the yellow section, that limited availability, within that, there are different levels of restriction, and we consider this to be a relatively restrictive restriction. Brazil and Chile naturally have relatively large private markets compared to, say, private markets in Europe and large private markets in the pharmaceutical industry as a whole, hence the low public availability. The value of this really is that it shows the breakdown of public availability across Latin America and highlights as well where we don't have data just yet. The second way to look at this, and as we transition through these key performance indicators, you can essentially see we're running through a funnel. We're going from what is globally available to what's regional, what's local, and so forth. So this now looks at the regional availability across our cohort of medicines and across our period. You'll notice that the number of products we're looking at is now 101 instead of 185. And the reason for this is we have taken only medicines that have marketing authorization in any one of the Latin American countries. This really indicates to us those products that have been launched or are fully within the process in Latin America. This gives a slightly more representative view of the market, and we can see if you take the definition of availability here, which includes full availability and limited availability, that the picture is slightly higher. The average goes up to around 24%, so approximately a quarter of the medicines here are available. This next section then tiers very neatly from the last, which is let's split that section out by full and limited availability. It shows that approximately, in Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina, there's a high proportion of limited availability due to the definitions. For example, in Argentina, we used a full availability definition as something that is included on the National Oncology Drug Bank, or on the limited section, it would be those that are PAMI, PMO, or SURF formularies. In Brazil, you can reference these all, by the way, on that one of the very first slides I showed you at the start, but I think it's important to put this into context and to give you the country-specific definition information. What's interesting for me, having taken this from a European lens, but also for the benefit of this discussion, is to say that limited availability is much more prevalent in Latin America than it is in Europe. We see significant amounts of limited availability in oncology sections in Europe, but mostly it's more towards the full unrestricted availability in European markets. Most importantly, I think, as we continue to go on our journey through the landscape, is to look at this key performance indicator, which is the rate of local availability. This shows and provides a more representative view of those that are likely to be assessed for availability in each country. It takes those that we can find with a marketing authorization date and determines to what extent those products are available or not. Within this, it's always important to put the sample size alongside this study. I'll give you a very good example where in the European study we look at, I think it might be Serbia, where the time to availability is very, very quick according to our study, but we're basing it off the availability of, say, 5 of the 200 medicines. Here, it's just as important to have the context. And so what we've done in this blue section underneath is not just provide the rate of local availability, the success, but also the extent to which it's representative of the total globally available medicines approved. We see some data gaps. I've mentioned the data gaps a few times, but I want to keep bringing it back up because it becomes increasingly important here. We see data gaps for the marketing authorization dates for Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Peru, which is perhaps why they see a slightly higher availability rate. But once again, this is something that over time will be increasingly accurate. And when we are recording the information, we're of course looking for information on reimbursement status, but also local marketing authorization dates. So the availability of those two numbers helps us ultimately improve the total figure. Now, as we move neatly into our other main metric, which is around the time, this KPI is around the time to availability from the local marketing authorization date. And I think from my perspective, it's the most interesting one to view because we're truly looking at within a country as the time to availability from a local marketing authorization to local reimbursement. There is many learnings to be made from looking at what happens should we compare to the FDA, but I think from my perspective, this is a really interesting chart to start with, and hence shows a prioritization of Latin American markets and the length of the regulatory process, P&R process. So across here, we see a broad range from Colombia taking approximately 43 days using 46, 45 data points. And in Chile, we see over 1,000 days using approximately 10 data points. We see, to give that extra context, is that Brazil and Chile likely have the longest time to availability due to the size of private markets, where companies launch in private first and then ultimately move into the public domain. And I think these types of the local nuances are those that you can use when discussing these results in its true context. Taking the next step and comparing to the US launch status, if we were to do this versus when a molecule is approved by the US FDA, the picture looks very different. We actually see that the average number of days increases multiple times, and that the prioritization of Latin American markets following a US launch, as well as the regulatory processes as a whole, is captured here. Argentina and Colombia actually swap places between this slide and the previous slide, where you can see that the regulatory process for Argentina is shorter than that of Colombia. And so what you essentially see is that 43 days for Colombia versus the local marketing authorization date appearing faster. Here, it's important to be conscious that there are a number of reasons for these durations, from market prioritization to the differences in regulatory processes to the lack of partners for small companies in Latin American markets. There are a myriad of reasons. And in Europe, these range from the time to prior authorization, the speed of the regulatory process itself, just as it may well do here, to the pricing and reimbursement approaches, to the initiation of the process, to the speed of the national decision making, to the value assessment, to the evidence requirements, to the health system readiness, and the patient differentiation and choice, as well as multi-layered decision making. So what we're doing here is providing that full picture and allowing you those discussions to go on, following on from this. My second to last, my penultimate slide, my penultimate key performance indicator to show you is the time to availability mapped using all three dates. Now, what you see here is the full picture by market. So what we've done is we've taken the average duration from, and let's use Argentina as an example, we've used the average duration from FDA marketing authorization to EMA marketing authorization, approximately 300 days, just less than a year. And then from that period, we've taken the average duration from EMA to local marketing authorization date, and then to public reimbursement, public availability status. And what that gives you, from my perspective, is that the prioritization of Latin American markets following US and EU launch and the length of the regulatory process, all in one complete picture. Once again, it's important to show on the left-hand side, that blue bar down the side, which is the number of locally approved and available medicines from which this is calculated. So because we have limited numbers of data points to play with, this is the most appropriate way to view the complete figure. To summarize, and before I hand over for comments, it's important to remind you that this is focused on what I've showed you as the combined cohort. That is the oncology medicines plus the orphan medicines in total. And I think when we publish these reports, once we publish this document and the key performance indicators within it, you'll be able to split out what's going on in the oncology market, what's going on in the orphan medicine space. And I think the key comment to take away is that for oncology, for example, the rate of global availability in Latin America is actually a little bit higher. For orphans, it's a little lower. And then the other big point to take away is whilst oncology, whilst the rate of global availability in Latin America for oncology is higher, it actually takes a little longer for reimbursement to occur for those medicines. And I think this full picture gives you a good view of the availability regionally, locally, globally, the times, and the cohort split. Over time, we can see this growing out to other segments, whether that be non-orphan oncology medicines, which is essentially the ultra-rare space, or to including the broader new innovative medicines cohort, which would have things like the new diabetes drugs in, or cardiovascular products and so forth. And so that this for me really ties up very neatly the discussion on the importance of the weight indicator, learning from Europe, translating to Latin America, the methodology, which I hope you understand, and if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat, the results, which you should be able to look in more detail, and I think some of the key findings. So with that in mind, we have a team working with FeePharma on this project. Please reach out to us with any questions that you have alongside this, and I will pass back to our next speaker to comment on the results.
Thank you, Max, and very interesting. There are some questions already coming in the Q&A, so maybe if you want to answer in writing, so we can then go to the panel, to discuss other questions. So now I want to give the floor to Janet, our executive director, and I think she has the luck maybe that she was in the public sector, right, listening to these kind of reports in other areas. And then she also, when she was the head of the Colombia Association, she was also presenting this kind of data to stakeholders, right? So I think she can really talk about the perspective that we have as industry, the country level, because these discussions are at the country level, right? And then also now at the regional level, how she sees this. So Janet, please go ahead with your remarks.
Thank you, Diego. Thank you very much, Diego, for especially because of all the effort that you put for this to happen, and thanks to Max and all the team for everything they've done to end up in this presentation of the report today. I do think it is a great presentation, but most I do think it is a great report, and a report that we could all use. We could all use, and we could all assess, and we could use in every single country to do a lot with it. But I just want to come and talk about 3 messages regarding the presentation that Max just made to all of us. The first, and responding a little bit of your comment, Diego, the first thing is that with the FeePharma Patients Weight Indicator, we have the first study of this kind for our region. I think it is a great study that looks at the availability and the time to access of innovative medicines across the time. And very important, we are expecting in FeePharma to run it periodically. This is important because this is a baseline. We need to gather more information in the future to really be able to do comprehensive analysis with it. As everyone could see with what Max presented, this report brings clear data on the number of innovative medicines available to patients in our region and the time to patient access. It really provides an incredible overview, but I just don't want us to lose the most important message of all. And we're talking here about patients. That's why every number, every timeline that we see, it's patients that are here. So I do think very important to see all the charts and all the graphics that Max presented, but never forget that basically we're talking here about patients, and we're talking here about patients having access to treatment that are relevant for them. So that's like my first message regarding the data that we have, the report that we have, and basically the value of it. Second, I just want to highlight one of the key findings of this report in general, because again, Max made all the presentation and gave all the data, but as you could see, the average times between market authorization and patient access has a huge, I think the word is huge, variation between markets, and it goes from 1.5 years to even more than 3.5 years, depending if we're taking the date, depending on the date used, if it's FDA or if it's the local registration. But I do think that this requires an analysis. I mean, seeing these big, differences and variations makes us think about, what we really need to do to have something, to basically to give value to what we're finding. But one thing that I also want to point out in this case, Max already mentioned it, but I think it's important to mention, again, it's that this report does not look at the root causes of this timeline to access. I mean, we're just giving the KPIs, we're giving the information, we're giving the data. And now we go to my third message, and it's what should we do with this data? And what we are aiming to do in FIFARMA is engaging with key stakeholders locally with this data, and basically doing an analysis between all of us, an analysis that should lead us to define areas in which we would need to work locally in the country. So I do think that this report, even if it's KPIs, and it's a baseline, it also invites us to do something relevant with it, and that's the next step that we want to aim in FIFARMA. And finally, important to mention that we want to run this, as I said it, periodically, but also we want more countries and we want more companies across LATAM to join the project. We do think that this would make this a more robust report that will be of more value to all of the stakeholders of the health sectors in LATAM, but also, and I think I saw one question in the webinar around it, we want to expand the product cohort as well. We're only here including oncology and orphan medicines. We want to include all innovative medicines, and I think this will be also very important for our report in the future. Again, thanks, Max, for this presentation. Thanks, Diego, for all your energy and effort for this to happen. And we will keep on working on it. And of course, looking forward to questions from the participants.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. So now we are going to move to the Q&A to the panel. And I also want to mention, so besides Max and Janet, so Andre Balalai, he is also joining. He is an associate principal, value and access in IQVIA, and Andre is originally from Brazil. So he spent a decade, working on topics related to market access, health economics, healthcare technology assessment, real world data science, and he has a really deep knowledge from the countries, from the market. So he's going to be joining us in the panel. He's based in New York, and as I mentioned, he also is part of the IQVIA team that is working on consulting in pharmaceuticals. So maybe, Max, if you want, maybe we can take out the screen, the slides, so just to see each other's. And I think there are some questions in the chat, but one, I was getting some questions also in the WhatsApp, right, by other people. So I think one thing is basically what you mentioned, Max, that this is we're not looking at the root cause analysis, right? Basically, we are looking at a picture that is accurate to June, and there are gaps in the data, right? In particular, in the countries that you highlighted, Argentina and Costa Rica, there is asymmetry of information in some of these. So when you think about Max, the limitations of the study, besides what we are discussing, first time we're doing it, cross-sectional, what other limitations do you see? And also, maybe one of the questions is, are these mutually the reimbursement, the way that we define availability in private and public, understanding that if a product might be in private and might not be in public, or might be in public and also in private, where is going to be counted, right, to ensure that we are not double counting products. So if you can address these two first questions.
Sure. Let me take the last one first. So the way we do it to ensure we're not double counting is we focus on medicines that are only privately available. Not are they in the private market, we focus on are they only privately available. And through that methodology, you're separating out what is private market and what is public. We could very easily include information on whether something is being used within the private market, but I think from the perspective of the purpose of the study, which is to truly find out what is reimbursed in a country, paid for by that country itself, it therefore is important to look at that public reimbursement. I think the caveats that we've discussed around the data availability, since we were able to plug some of the gaps ourselves through public sources, I would consider the caveats to be to have been smaller from what we were originally looking at maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks ago. And I think the results that you can look at today are fairly representative of the total picture. And I would say that we can expect to see that over time, as we build into different sections of the market, it will be a more fully representative study in the sense that it represents the new diabetes medicines, oncology medicine, or not oncology medicines, but cardiovascular products, those type of things, where I do believe we will, and from what I've seen in the European study, where you will see differences in the time and you will see differences in the rate. So from that perspective, the caveat is we are focused on oncology and orphan because those are two key priority areas. They also represent a significant portion of the market. But in terms of caveats, I think there is a small caveat around the data availability, and I think there's a larger caveat around the total market perspective. For orphans and oncologics, I think this is a very comprehensive approach, given the first study of its kind.
Thank you. I also want just to mention, and before Andrea, sorry, I think some products might be undergoing reimbursement analysis or assessment, or might have already submitted and been denied. So we are not capturing that, or might be already going regulatory approval, right? So that those are things that we have considered. And again, we are not looking at root causes or trying to name and shame, right, any player or stakeholder. So just for you, to take this data as is, as a cross section. So Andre, I was going to make a question, so maybe you can comment on Max, but also when you look at this, and we have Colombia, right, as the country that might have the highest rate of availability, what is your take on that, right? And was that a surprise for you, knowing the system, the systems in the region? So maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Diego, and thanks, Max, for the explanation. So one of the important, before I jump, it was not a surprise for me, Colombia, especially based on our definitions. And then we need to take into consideration that Latin Americas are typically hybrid markets. So they public and private will, happens at the same time, but mostly there's a very important component of subnational access, right? And in each country we have different subnational definitions, like in Brazil, it will be the states. In Mexico, it will be the federal institutions, or like SEDENA, SEMAR, PEMEX. Then in Colombia, we can call subnational the difference between the contributivo and subsidiado. So we know that when we define full reimbursement, we're talking about the last step of reimbursement, right? That is like available for everyone. But we know that reimbursement is kind of, is a shade of access. So since from very small reimbursement in the beginning, only with premium institutions, we've developed in the subnational and then going to the national one. So every time you look for these charts, take in mind that these steps to happen full reimbursement will be different in different countries. So for instance, when you look for Colombia, it's likely to be, to have like a better picture of access, because, as the implementation of MIPRES and this non-PBS, PBS UPC funding by others will bring access earlier, but not for the entire population. But at the same time, when the question that we had about like public and private, we need to separate Brazil and Chile that have an established private environment, and especially in Brazil, where you have independent HTA evaluation from COSAUDE and having this independent formulary, then actually the private market from prepagadas in Argentina, in Mexico, even in Colombia, that tend to be more private insurance that actually will be premium, So it's always take in mind that they will be, that these nuances of each of the markets. The same thing when we compare Mexico to Colombia, and then was not a surprise for me having Colombia in the first time, is that from the recent changes on the Mexican healthcare system, especially with the creation of INSABI, we know that the former Cuadro Básico become the compendium. And then by definition, as we assume, national reimbursement will be included in the compendium. But we know that there will be some additional negotiations to happen with the federal institutions like IMSS, ISSSTE, and even with INSABI, that will take a little bit longer. But because we define and we align that compendium will be, like Mexico can slightly be perceived as like a higher degree of full access. Then when we look for Brazil, for instance, there's an important caveat to highlight here, is that oncology in Brazil has its own nuances. So we know that the reimbursement of oncology in Brazil has these bundle payments that we named APAC. So not necessarily when a technology is recommended like Conitec, it will be actually reimbursed. So, and then when you see the private market in Brazil that have like 50 million people, that is bigger than most of the Latin American markets. So we need to separate when you look, Brazil is a smaller full access, let's say public access, but then having, a big chunk of access in the private, that is a pretty large market, but it's still only exclusive for this 25% of the population in Brazil, that is still big. So every time, and then finally in Chile, because we are also looking for some rare diseases that in Brazil, you have like some nuances of these exceptional reimbursement pathways that exist in Brazil. But when we look for Chile, there will be Lei Ricardo Soto that actually will make Chile looks a little bit better if you look for a broad range of drugs, So I feel my message here is every time you look for these charts, don't look only with the numbers and saying one is better than another, but take in mind that the system, they have their own specific nuances of how, public broad access will happen. But doesn't necessarily that when you say like limited access, that nobody will have access to that. It's like a pathway, it's a construction of access. And this is one of the purpose of our first intention of this study is to show, okay, what is the picture? As Diego mentioned, like we're not explaining what happened, but we're showing what's the picture.
Thank you. No, thank you. Very comprehensive. I think, Janet, now turning to you, because I mean, and this is something that has been mentioned. So to have a code in the formulary or to be in the formulary doesn't mean that you have access, right? Because there is funding gaps, and we know our countries are not investing as much as they should. You have this private market, this public market, as Andrea was presenting, and then we have, like beyond the regulatory approval and then the HTA approval, then you have clinical guidelines, you have other policies that are implemented by countries to try to make control demand or to incentivize, disincentivize supply. So what is your commentary, Janet, maybe on this, right? So because at the end, what we want to have is access to innovation to patients that are in need, right? And that will be measuring how many patients are you treating. So we are not looking at that kind of, KPI, but what is your maybe take on this?
Thanks, Diego. And I think that with your question, but also I was looking at the Q&A. I mean, there are a lot of questions regarding, I was curious because I remember our first meeting with Max and all the team in which even ourselves, when we were seeing the data, we had so many questions of, why is this happening? How can you compare it to other countries? I mean, there were so, and so the first thing I would want to say again, and I'm sorry, Diego, I'm just taking advantage of this moment to start answering a little bit of this is a picture of June 2022, and this is a baseline. We need to keep on working, and our commitment as FIFARMA is we will keep on doing this report to see how are we changing. I'm not going to say, well, we can say improve because at the end we want to improve access. So, but the baseline is very important. And another question, and maybe linked with what you were mentioning, Diego, is basically what we will do with this information. And I just mentioned it when I was talking, that now that I was listening to Andres' comment, Andre was doing something that I call the double click. basically he was going a little bit into every, he mentioned Brazil, he mentioned Colombia, he mentioned Chile, and he was doing a double click. And I do think that this double click or this analysis will, is the most important part that we need to start working on tomorrow. I do think that locally we need to start engaging with so many stakeholders. I think one question out there was with which stakeholders? In every single country, we always have ministries of health, we have the regulatory agency, we have the evaluation agent, the HTA agency in case they have one. We have several like common, but we also have different. In Brazil, the private
ANS.
I'm learning of every country now, but ANS, we would need to work, we sit down there, also part of this conversation. And I do think that that is, again, the most valuable part of what should come with this report is how do we engage with data that is very relevant data that gives us incredible insights, but again, the double click part and the analysis among all of us, it's going to be a key thing in the process. I don't know if I answered your question, Diego, but I was just trying to take a little bit of advantage of the moment to even talk about many of the things that are in the Q&A that was out.
Thank you for trying to. So I think this is good. And then for people that is asking, this is just literally out of the oven, right? We're really showing you a preview. So as Janet was mentioning, we want to see, okay, how the pharma companies are doing, right? Because we are 18 companies, right? So is this different? Because these companies have maybe more footprint in Latin America. What happens when you look at SMEs, the small, medium enterprises that are doing all this innovation? Because many of the innovation might not be coming from large pharma companies, right? So is there like a footprint thing that is impeding them to have a, registered product? So we have so many data that we need to cut differently to get different insights. But at the end, I think the discussion has to be also at the local level, right? So we can have this double click that Jared was mentioning that Nuri was trying to give us. So I know that we are approaching the end in 2 minutes. So I just want, Max, going back to you. This has been done in Europe for 15 years, and you have been doing this systematically, right? You have been adding more countries, and every year you are showing progress. There are countries that are using this weight indicator or some stakeholders just to measure how good policies they are doing to improve access, or maybe trying to compare, right? Before and after they do some decisions. Can you comment a little bit on that before we close?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's 2 points around this that we can take. First is, I think you touched upon it, which is there is a lot of information that we can now look into to define what characteristics of, say, a company or footprint or a product that may emerge as challenging for access in Latin America. So that it ultimately provides a foundation of data as well as a foundation of knowledge. We also have seen that, say, countries use it to measure policies exactly as you mentioned. And what we've seen using the European study is in Ireland, when there was a challenge to access for cystic fibrosis, that the picture of Ireland moved significantly down the rankings over time. The UK, even though they have very good, very strict approaches to health tech appraisal and timelines, ultimately the number of products that are being approved over time has fallen. Not only that, the number of products that are being approved with restrictions on top, so restrictions to subpopulation through things like the Cancer Drugs Fund, for example, are all visible within the weight indicator. So it's twofold for me, Diego. It's one, you can see new factors that you potentially had ideas about, but you were never able to check. And two, you can see the real impact of policies over time.
Great, thank you, Max. So I think, we are out of time. So I want to thank you all for joining today. I want to thank Max, Andrea, and Janet for their comments. We're going to have the recording of this session, and FIPHARMA will do with IQVIA a launch of the full report in the next 2 weeks. So please stay tuned to know more. And any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. You have our emails, and the IQVIA team also provided their contact details. So thank you and have a nice afternoon all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.